27th of August 1941, in the port of Tallinn amassed tens of thousands of Soviet refugees. The Baltic Fleet was given orders to immediately leave the city and head to Leningrad. The Germans had already taken the majority of Estonia. The journey of our ships to Leningrad was subject to massive tragedy. In the Finnish Gulf, they were attacked by the air force of the Luftwaffe. 163 ships were sunk, 11,000 died. At the same time, Leningrad was in mortal danger. Hitler ordered that the entire city be erased from the face of the earth. He was absolutely direct in his words and orders that the entire population of Leningrad was to be killed, every last person. The Battle of Leningrad became the largest defense of a major city in the whole history of World War II. It lasted 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days. This was a unique event in history, and events such as this have not been witnessed before. A city of millions that was completely blockaded off from any supplies, that held on and never capitulated despite losing over 1 million of its population. Why did Hitler's forces stop at the foot of Leningrad? Who helped him encircle the eastern capital? How did the people of Leningrad survive during the time of the blockade? I interrupt this video with a brief message. Thank you for tuning in. I wanted to make this translation for a long time in memory of my grandmother. My grandmother lived through the siege and the blockade of Leningrad. She was only a little girl, 5 years of age, and she survived the entire blockade within the city. The horrors that she witnessed and lived through are unspeakable, and my memories of her are only through pictures that I now have. So this video is a tribute to her and to every citizen of Leningrad that lived through this enormous tragedy of our people. 4th of September 1941, the outskirts of Leningrad came under the deafening bombardment of artillery fire of German howitzers. 2 smaller villages, Chudno and Tosne, to the south of Leningrad were captured. The rail lines were cut, which connected the city to Moscow. Now the German army stood only 56 kilometers away from the center of Leningrad. The 8th of September, first wave of bombardments covered the city. In only the first day, the Germans dropped over 6,000 bombs on the city. 178 fires were reported to have been started as a result. The bombardments took out the major supply warehouses of food and other goods for the city. The fires destroyed over 3,000 tons of flour and 2.5 tons of sugar. The same day came more terrifying news. The Germans had come around the banks of Lake Ladoga and had captured Schillisburg. They had fully encircled the city. The city had been completely cut off from all other territories of the Soviet Union. Food and heating supplies were left for only 30 days. Soviet poet Olga Bergovets wrote in her diary, "It seems that the tragedy of Leningrad is nearing." At that time, the member of the Ministry of Defense, Georgy Malenkov, was in the city, and his son Andrei recounts that his father was completely shocked to witness what had happened in the city at the time. The front line of Leningrad was a complete chaotic mess. Communications between many of the units were cut off. Some of the commanders of the divisions and battalions were nowhere to be found. The commander of Leningrad, Zhdanov, was hiding in his secret bunker and was intoxicated beyond comprehension. Commander of the front, Leningrad, Clement Varyslov, had also lost all self-control. The marshal could not believe that the Germans would be able to fully encircle the city. He sent all available reserves close to the Finnish border. Varyslav had let the soldiers themselves pick their battalion commanders, and this step had undermined the discipline of his soldiers. The amount of deserting soldiers grew. He ordered all troops on board any military ships to report to the front and personally commanded the counterattacks on German tanks at the village of Krasnaya Sela. When the Germans had finished the encirclement of the city, Varyslav and Zhdanov came up with a plan to surrender the city. The Baltic Fleet commander Chubutz was ordered to prepare the sinking of all military and transport ships. Inside Leningrad, there was a plan to blow up over 400 factories, all ports, and all bridges. For the Soviet Union, Leningrad was colossal important. You could even say it was more important than Moscow in some ways. That's where the revolution took place. That's where all the aurora lights lit up. This is the city that bears the name of Lenin. So for the Soviet Union, this was something almost sacred. Moscow is the center of control and strength where Stalin sits, where the party gathers, but Leningrad was the soul of the USSR. You could call it the spiritual capital of the USSR. For Lenin, this throwback to the empire was not important at all. For Stalin, it was critically important. If you took into account all the parameters, Leningrad was of massive importance. This was the second most populated city in the USSR after Moscow, a city of 3 revolutions. And when Hitler was planning the siege of the city, he knew about the importance of the city, and that's why he made it a central point that the city must be erased and exterminated like Bolshevism. After the destruction of the USSR, the city is not needed by us. Therefore, it is critical that the population be completely exterminated. And after that, the city can be leveled to nothing. This was the plan, and Hitler did not want to stray from this in the slightest. The 9th of September, 1941, Zhdanov and Varyslav received an urgent telegram from Stalin. I'm disappointed in your performance, since it seems like the only thing you are reporting are the losses of one region or another, and you don't bother to utter a word about what you are doing in response to this so that you can finally stop losing towns and strategic centers. Your loss of Schlittenberg was an embarrassment. When will the losses stop? Or maybe you have already decided to give up Leningrad. That same day in Moscow, there was a decision. In the Stavka, Stalin announced that 43-year-old Georgy Zhukov would be the new commander-in-chief of the Leningrad front. This talented Soviet commander was given the most problematic and most difficult tasks on the front line. Just a few days prior, Zhukov was able to beat the Germans back in the village of Yemen, just under the larger city of Smolensk. This was one of the first victories of the Red Army since the start of the war. Now Stalin had ordered the general to defend Leningrad at any cost. The 10th of September, Zhukov immediately flew to Leningrad. Upon reaching Lake Ladoga, the plane came under fire. The military plane, Zhukov on board miraculously was not taken down by heavy fire. Immediately upon landing, he went to Smolny, but the guard did not immediately let him in and meticulously checked his papers. It was said that after this ordeal, Zhukov kicked down the door to the conference room. Firing Varyslav, he immediately called to report to Moscow. There will be no measures taken to prepare the city to surrender. We will defend the city down to the last person. Zhukov ordered that discipline in the army be restored immediately. Picking battalion commanders was immediately canceled. Anyone who was caught leaving their post would be shot. Even families or civilians who surrendered to the Germans would be subject to being shot. The infamous order was numbered 4976, and it read, "Families who surrender are subject to being executed upon their surrender. If they happen to return, they are subject to being executed upon their release." Despite the draconian nature of such an order, the nature of the order was probably meant to have more of a threatening character. It practically was never acted upon by any of the commanders and was later redacted. All able-bodied men and women of Leningrad were ordered in the construction of new defensive lines. The war continued around the clock in several rotations. In several regions of the front, underground wires were laid. In the Mariansk theater shop, 150 decoy tanks were built from cardboard and wood. Zhukov ordered they be placed in the region of Pulkova to fool the enemy. In the city itself, 4,000 were armed snipers, and over 22,000 firing points were placed around the city in various high points. From the population of the city, 10 divisions of civilian militias were formed. Towards the end of September, the advancement of the German forces suddenly came to an unexpected pause. This is one battle we can't purely judge from a military point of view, and that's because there's not a single battle that had such tragic consequences to the civilian population such as this one. That's because despite how the situation on the battlefield was, the suffering inflicted on the civilians was indescribable due to the blockade. Sure, the blockade is a military maneuver, but civilians were not just dying under fire or exclusively from shelling. No, they were starving. So when we remember the Battle of Leningrad, the fight is not just the army. No, we remember the blockade. This was a tragedy for the whole population. Leningrad was one of the main goals of the Operation Barbarossa. Taking the city was one of the main objectives of Army Group North that numbered about 700,000. It mainly consisted of infantry divisions that were directed to the Eastern Front from the south in Europe. Commander of Army Group North, Field Marshal Henry von Loob, was considered a competent field marshal. And as an officer of the old school of commanders, he was keen to observe details and was not afraid to be critical of some of the military decisions of Hitler. Henry von Loob, who was given the Knight's Honor due to his service during the First World War, absolutely a highly educated and competent man, was kicked out of the army when Hitler was cleansing the army of people who were not completely sold on his brand of Nazism. So first, he got rid of him, but when the war started, he enticed him to serve once more. And when he got the order to stop the offensive and focus on the blockade of Leningrad, he defiantly kept on the offensive. He made a final attempt to take the city by infantry, but it failed. 29th of September 1941, the German army gave special directive about the future of Leningrad. In it said, "The Führer has made the decision to erase the city from the face of the earth. After the destruction of the Soviet army, the existence of this city will no longer serve any purpose, and I suggest to blockade the city tightly, fire artillery, and bomb it without ceasing. If this leads to a situation where the city is ready to surrender, do not agree to their surrender." Hitler made the decision that Leningrad will not exist at all. The Wehrmacht is an assault army, and it needs to focus on strikes made with artillery and bombs and not get involved in an urban conflict that requires different training and different tactics. Plus, if the city was taken, the German administration would somehow have to provide for the citizens of the city. If the Germans were to enter the city amidst the massive mass starvation taking place, that means that they would also be exposed to mass disease and plague. Therefore, he said, we're not going to feed them and let everyone in the city die a slow death. During the first half of October, coming to the aid of the Germans, the 250th Brigade of the Spanish army arrived under Leningrad. The Spanish soldiers typically wore blue shirts, and for this reason they were often referred to as the Blue Division. It was formed in Madrid in July of 1941. Most of the soldiers serving were volunteers. Venturing to faraway Russia, the soldiers went for ideological reasons. In their own words, they wanted to fight communists because they blamed them for provoking the civil war in Spain. You're watching rare footage of those soldiers in the footage in front of you. The Spanish volunteers on the front of Leningrad are acting out a popular activity in Spain, the traditional people's entertainment, bullfighting. Prior to going to battle, every Spanish soldier pledged his allegiance. Under God, with complete faith, I pledge my allegiance to the head of the German army, Adolf Hitler. With his fight against communism, I pledge to fight as a brave soldier and to give my life at any moment to fulfill this pledge. During 1 year of the war, 40 to 50,000 soldiers served in this division. In the battle for Leningrad, this division held a position just under Lake Ladoga. In the north, to hold the blockade, Hitler had help from another ally, Marshal of Finland Karl Mannerheim. He wanted to return the territories he lost as a result of the Finnish-Soviet War. The Finnish army invaded the USSR 29th of June 1941. They were able to take the majority of the Soviet Karelina, including the cities of Vyborg and Petrozavodsk. In the beginning of the fall, the Finnish troops stopped on the Karelian Isthmus, just 30 kilometers north of Leningrad. September 11th, 1941, the president of Finland, Rudi, gave this message to the German ambassador. If Leningrad will no longer cease to exist as a city, then this will be a fine border for Finland on the Karelian Isthmus. Leningrad must be liquidated. The Finnish blockade of Leningrad is exactly the same blockade as the blockade of the German fascists. We shouldn't make any distinctions between the two. They were just as much the aggressors as were the Germans. They were responsible for countless deaths of civilian population. Yes, Mannerheim had a lot in common with the Russian people. He was born on the territory, but he was very anti-Soviet. Maybe it's going too far to say that he was a Russophobe. Maybe he still had some fond memories from his youth, and not to mention that his wife was Russian. He was married to the daughter of the General Arapov. That's also worth remembering. He had 2 daughters with her. Despite all this, as a politician, he was absolutely pro-German and pro-Hitler. Hitler was sort of a mentor for him. Hitler personally gave him the Knight's Honor of the Iron Cross. He also very much supported the idea of a Great Finland, the theory that Finland at a minimum needed to take the Soviet Karelian, or what they referred to as the Southern Karelian, and all the territories around Lake Ladoga. In the middle of October 1941, the Germans took Petrograd and then broke through to the southern border of the Finnish Gulf. Firing on columns of the Wehrmacht, Soviet warships covered them with artillery. The flagship of the Baltic Fleet was the Soviet warship Murad. This massive, imposing ship was built in 1914 and originally was called Petropavlovsk. It served in the First World War, the Revolutionary War, and the Soviet-Finnish War. The Murad had 12 artillery batteries that fired artillery rounds 470 kilograms in weight at a range of up to 30 kilometers. Every battery could fire 3 rounds in 1 minute. In the first days of the blockade, the ship fired 963 rounds in the largest caliber. The German pilots received the order that no matter the cost, take out the ship. 16th of September 1941, it was attacked by 27 fighter bomber jets. 4 bombs managed to land on a portion of the ship, but the ship remained. The second time it was attacked was the 23rd of September. German ASS Gas Ulrich, a rider flying the bomber number 87, dropped a 250-kilogram bomb that made a direct impact and managed to hit the main compartment where the artillery was stored. The explosion that resulted was of terrifying power. One of the radar towers flew high into the air before crashing down. The entire nose section of the ship was destroyed. The explosion killed 324 people, including the commander of the ship. The Murad turned on its side, but it did not sink. Soon after, some of the artillery batteries were repaired and the ship was able to resume firing on the German positions. The half-destroyed ship was able to destroy 86 German howitzers. In the region of Raunenbaum, heavy artillery started dropping on the Germans from the Krasnaya Gorka. The fortification was built in the beginning of the 20th century, especially to protect the Kronstadt and Petrograd. This fort consisted of dozens of well-fortified howitzers. The artillery systems had a firing radius of 25 kilometers. The 500-kilogram artillery rounds incinerated German tanks. The Germans tried to take the fort, but approaching the Soviet stronghold was not an easy task. They never managed to take the fort. So if we look at the map, we see something very interesting in this configuration. The foothold that the Germans were able to take has a clear radius. Well, why? Because that's exactly the radius that the Baltic fleet could reach. Because the ships in the Baltic fleet never ceased firing artillery at the advancing German positions, the Germans couldn't advance past those areas. Why? Because the German infantry didn't have artillery with that kind of range. The heavy caliber big artillery that the Baltic fleet had really helped prevent the Germans from advancing from certain positions that they would have wanted to have. The famous Fort Krasnaya Gorka really prevented the Germans from having the kind of siege they wanted. Precisely for this reasons, the Germans had to bring in their famous long-range artillery that methodically destroyed civilian targets in the city. November 1941, the Germans placed their heavy artillery batteries to the south of Leningrad. Half of all the systems were German short-barrel howitzers. This system fired a 250-kilogram round up to 60 kilometers. The other half of the equipment was French or Czech-made. The most powerful of these systems was the French railroad howitzers, taking a 400-millimeter round, and it could fire on targets even in the north part of the city. In some areas where the Germans managed to bring artillery systems to the foot of the city, they stood a mere 16 kilometers away from the Winter Palace. During good weather, the Germans were able to spot the dome of Isaac's Cathedral and other tall landmarks. The heaviest artillery bombardments were in the beginning and the end of the workday, as that was the time the most amount of civilians were out. The Germans targeted bridges, residential areas, essential stores. Some tall buildings they decided not to destroy. They used these tall buildings and domes as landmarks to be able to orient the rest of their artillery fire. For example, there was an order given not to fire on the Kronstadt Naval Cathedral. Its large dome the Germans used to orient their artillery and aviation. During the course of the blockade on Leningrad, there were over 148,000 rounds of artillery fired on the city and 107 aerial bombs dropped on the city. However, the bombing campaign proved to be not as effective as the Germans anticipated. The amount of firepower the Germans used was far greater than when they had attacked London or when the Russians finally took Berlin. Most of the historic buildings of Leningrad were cleverly hidden in camouflage. Work began to camouflage and protect the historical monuments and buildings. How was this done? Large tree trunks and bags of sand were built up as barricades to protect buildings from the brunt of an explosion. We know for certain that at least 3 important monuments were saved this way: the Cathedral of Peter I, Cathedral of Nikolai I, and Lenin's monument. The city officials knew that in order to save the city, they needed to take these measures. As a result of all the aviation strikes, all the artillery strikes, not a single bridge was brought down. The Institute of Smolny was unharmed. So from the viewpoint of cultural preservation, Leningrad that was in this blockade was not destroyed. The main purpose of the bombing was to cause fires throughout the city that would burn all of this down. This didn't work for them because there were special groups that were formed of girls and women that would be perched high up on buildings, and whenever a fire broke out, they had bags of sand ready that they would pour out on any fire that would break out. From the bombing and artillery throughout the period of the blockade, 17,000 people died. The minimum number that died from starvation was 600,000, and some say much higher. Leningrad under blockade continued to work. All the administrative offices, the press, daycare, and the kindergartens, medical clinics, and the theater. The Kirsky factory, just 4 kilometers from the front line, never stopped work for a single day, repairing tanks and other weapons. In November, a deep freeze came over the city. The water lines froze and the heating stopped working. To keep warm, people began to burn books, furniture, and took anything apart made of wood. Any general supplies of food in stores were almost completely gone. When the supplies of flour had run out, bread was baked from bran cake, flour dust, and pine bark. Groceries were given out with ration cards. During the most severe months of the blockade, the working citizens were allotted 250 grams of bread a day. For soldiers, children, and the elderly, 125 grams. Party commanders and commanders on the front were given extra rations: 400 grams of bread, a bowl with meat or a bowl of fish soup, a little bit of oatmeal, and possibly a cube of sugar. Soviet poetess Olga Berbits recalls, "The hunger in Leningrad is desperate. Every cat and dog has been eaten. Every day dozens of people fall dead on the street. The people passing by don't pick them up anymore. When you walk the streets, all you see is bodies of the dead being pulled on sleds. One of the hardest things to get in Leningrad is a grave. To buy a grave, it will cost you 250 grams of bread, and for a tombstone, it's 2 kilograms. Hitler announced in his inner circle that the population of Leningrad was to be liquidated totally and completely. And again, I want to emphasize this. He was not saying it was fine if the citizens just, went somewhere as long as the city is free of the citizens. The Germans will come and take over the city. No, they're going to die there. Because there were strict orders that if civilians were seen leaving the city, they were to be chased back into the city with machine gun fire. Why? Because they needed to kill the population by starving them. They didn't want to have any chance that the prisoners would possibly take any sort of food supplies from the soldiers. The harshest winter was the winter of 1941 to 1942. The majority of people who died during that period. One of the reasons being is that the Germans were systematically bombing any food and product reserve that managed to be saved in the city. One that is worth noting is despite how desperate the situation had become, bread was still given out daily, albeit the rations were tiny. Sugar was given out until December, until the most difficult period set in. You can read the records from people. People would gradually get weaker and weaker from malnutrition and hunger, and then they would become apathetic to everything around them. They would finally lay down in their bed and never wake up again. A huge amount of historical video evidence exists where you just see this frozen city. The citizens are gathering water from the frozen river. People are just lying dead on the streets. Of course, they were gathered as quickly as possible, but it wasn't always possible to do it immediately. There were days when up to 7,000 were needed to be taken by a special burial unit. Of course, you get these frightening images of people wasting away who in reality were no different than the people in the concentration camps, starved, exhausted, but still unbeaten. The burial group of Leningrad was not able to work fast enough. In one day, in the Peskov cemetery, over 25,000 bodies amassed waiting to be buried. As a rule, people were buried in what they would call brotherly graves. According to different sources, during the whole time of the blockade, between 800,000 and 1.3 million people died. This is more than all the losses of Great Britain and the United States combined during the entire period of the Second World War. Why is it so hard to get an accurate count of those deceased? Well, because many people that were gathered in the streets and residential areas didn't have any documents on them. Many were buried in brotherly graves together, and these nameless people are the ones that make up these hundreds of thousands of unknown people. I think what we can say with full confidence is that the losses of the civilian population just from the blockade that both the German and Finnish army participated in was at least 1 million people. Already in the spring of 1942, Stalin ordered that the blockade of Leningrad be broken at any cost. To the east, near the town of Schlissenburg, the forces of Leningrad front and the Wolfens front were only 20 kilometers from each other. But to break the German defense without additional reserve seemed almost impossible. In the region of Nevskaya Dubrovska, the Soviet army managed to capture a small bridgehead that the Soviets called Nevsky Pitachok. It was a tiny piece of land, only 2 kilometers in width and only 800 meters deep. Some of the most intense fighting of the Second World War took place on this tiny bridgehead. Every day, fresh Soviet troops would make a perilous water crossing. The bridgehead was shot through by German artillery, and soldiers would literally have to just bury themselves upon arriving there. It's said that in just half a year of fighting, 50 to 85,000 Soviet soldiers lost their lives. In April 1942, when a deep freeze came over the region, sending the troops to the right bank seemed impossible. The Germans began their attack. Soon as the freeze began, the Germans immediately used this to their advantage. It turned out that the bridgehead itself was a group of around 500 men, so not a large group, but that group was able to be supplied, and when the freeze hit, they can't be resupplied, and the German force, a force about 10 times in number, began to advance. Our troops tried to send more, but they could only send 300. The ice just makes everything harder. So in the end, they couldn't send more and more, and the Germans took the bridgehead. This is probably one of the most dramatic and tragic battles of the war. It's tiny bridgehead where just an enormous amount of people lost their lives. Here the soldiers really did fight until the last man. And this did cause the Germans a lot of lives as well. The bridgehead, as well as the bridgehead in Armansbaum, played a big role in the defense of Leningrad because it kept the German forces from being able to collapse the defense of Leningrad completely. And the Germans knew that they didn't have much chance of a successful offensive. And even in the beginning, the command said, don't go into an offensive, hold the blockade. So what do troops that hold the blockade do? Well, they dig in. That was the grand plan of Hitler. The German soldiers hold their positions, draw the Soviet troops to them. Most important thing is to hold, and keep the line. Keep both the fronts frozen so they can't move anywhere, and keep them using up valuable resources in the war of attrition. At the same time, the enemy is dying of starvation. The only path that connected Leningrad with the rest of the mainland was on Lake Ladoga. Just after 1 week of the blockade, barges began crossing the lake. This is how the infamous Road of Life began. 30 kilometers was the distance to reach the mainland on the other side. In November, when the lake would freeze over, trucks would drive the route. They would bring what supplies they could, and when they would leave, they would take as many civilians as they could. In the winter, the lake would never fully freeze over. The ice was often cracked, some trucks would fall through the ice. The road was also constantly being hit with artillery and aviation bombs from the Germans. Just in the first month, when the route was open, 300 trucks were lost, about 10 a day. During the whole time of the blockade, 1.5 million tons of food were brought into the city from Leningrad. 1,300,000 people were evacuated. Thank God so much historic video is saved that show how trucks are driving this route. It's not always completely frozen over. It's under constant bombardment from artillery, and sometimes they sink, but they're bringing supplies nonetheless to the city. What they're bringing, well, food and products first and foremost. This was one of the biggest reasons why in February of 1942, they were able to increase the ration size of bread for military personnel, the civilian population, and everyone who was working hard in the city. On the way back, they evacuated everyone they could. People who were injured, children, of course, and that's why this route had the name the Road of Life. September 1942, the Soviet army was able to retake the bridgehead known as Nevsky Pitachok. The operation was led by a new commander, Leonid Gavarov. He suggested a new strategy to break the blockade, meeting the forces of Leningrad front with the forces of the Volhovsky front in the south of the Lake of Ladoga. This is where the German defense was the weakest. Knowing that the attack was coming, the Germans brought in all their additional forces. The Nevskaya Pitachka and the town of Mariina, this is where all the additional reserves were brought. The Soviet forces outnumbered the Germans 5-1. 18th of January 1943. 18th of January 1943. The blockade was broken. A narrow corridor between 8 and 11 kilometers was made with the mainland of Russia. In less than 3 weeks, a railroad was built across this territory that earned the name the Road of Victory. On this road, the tortured citizens of Leningrad began to get food, heating, and armaments. And there was this command to build this railroad. It was built under intense circumstances. Constant fire from the German side. There were sections that were under fire constantly. There exists the name called the Corridor of Death, victory salute that had not taken place in Moscow. At first, only in the cover of night would trains travel this route, and obviously at first it could never cover all the needs of the city. Became official. The strength of soul and will. Comrades, citizens of Leningrad, a unique event in history. The heroic Red Army has broken the blockade of Leningrad. Endured, survived. Builders under fire have laid down these railroad lines. Huge victory for the morale of the Russian people. For this reason, I would put they have given us today a direct line to our big motherland, at least on par with the Battle of Stalingrad. And here we have to remember that when the blockade was broken, President Roosevelt sent, starting right in February of 1943, Gorlov was ready to begin breaking the blockade completely. First, it was growing the army potential. But another important note to take is that the German Army Group North was becoming weaker and weaker. Hitler was rotating the most heavily armed groups. The German army was growing weaker while the Soviet army was growing stronger by the day. 14th of January 1944. Over 100 Soviet fighter planes opened fire on the Strauenbaum stronghold. This powerful and unexpected attack led to a massive loss of German defense. The Soviet advance lasted 2 weeks. 27th of January 1944. The blockade of Leningrad was completely defeated. The Red Army went to the borders of Latvia and Estonia. So the breaking of the blockade of Leningrad Everything was finished, almost with the full catastrophe of Army Group North. A massive hit was made, and they were on the retreat. So when we hit in the Baltics, one, the second one, the third, we began to move in domino fashion. As soon as our high commanders learned how to do this, it became obvious that the German commanders were not ready for the response they received, and as it didn't fit into what they thought they were going to be up against. In the newly liberated towns on the outskirts of Leningrad, a frightening picture awaited the Soviet soldiers. This film was taken in the beginning of February 1943, burning the Pavlovsky Cathedral that was built in the mid-1800s. From this cathedral, the Germans stole all the museum pieces: art, vases, watches, sculptures, furniture. As they were retreating, the Nazis set fire to the cathedral and destroyed its pavilions. They mined the ruins in all the territory nearby. They repeated this with all the other world-renowned museums. For example, in the Tsar's settlement, there was not one home left intact. Catherine's Cathedral was robbed of everything from which the Germans managed to steal, and a whole room that they took fully intact. The famous Petrograd fountains lay in ruin. From the outskirts of Leningrad, the Germans managed to steal over 100,000 museum artifacts. At the end of the war, the USSR was only able to recover a fraction of these items. The restoration of Leningrad and all its monuments continues to this day. After the blockade was lifted, there was 560,000 civilians left in the city, 5 times less than at the start of the war. 27th of January 1944, almost the entire city took to the streets. At 8 o'clock that evening, 24 rounds of artillery were fired in the air. That was the only victory salute that had not taken place in Moscow. At the order of Stalin, for May 1st, 1945, Leningrad was to be named the City of Heroes. In 1965, the name became official. The strength of soul and will, that amount of sacrifice that was given, this was a unique event in history. No one had seen a city of many millions in a blockade, endured, survived, lost over 1 million people, but never surrendered. This was a huge victory for the morale of the Russian people. For this reason, I would put the defense of Leningrad in first place, or at least on par with the Battle of Stalingrad. And here we have to remember that when the blockade was broken, President Roosevelt sent his famous telegram praising the heroic citizens of Leningrad that lived through absolutely inhuman conditions, but despite this, did not surrender. The 20th of October, 2022, the High Court of St. Petersburg recognized the blockade of Leningrad to be a genocide on the Russian people. In the decision of the court was stated, recognizing the blockade of Leningrad by the Germans and their allies, armed forces that were formed on the territories of Belgium, Italy, Spain, Netherlands, Norway, and Finland, and likewise the volunteer troops from Austria, France, Czech Republic. We declare this a war crime, a crime against humanity, and a genocide of the Russian people.